Okay. You're a genius. I'm so sorry.
Good.
Thank you for your patience. We are in this crazy world. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully, we're good to go. Oh, I never know when we're live, so I think we're live.
I think so.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for everyone for the patience, technical difficulties. Gotta love it. Um, I'm so excited to get started. Thank you for joining us for our May Q&A talk. My name is Sarah Hopkins. I'm on our board of directors or board members, whatever. And I am so excited to host my first ever Q&A talk. These Q&A talks connect rural parents and caregivers of LGBTQIA plus youth with the resources they need to ensure that their children can grow up safe and authentically. Q&A Talks is an initiative of Project Q&A and is made possible by grants from the Independence Area Community Chest and the American Library Association's Libraries Transforms Communities Focus on Rural and Small Library grant in partnership with the Independence Public Library. Oh, that's a mouthful. Tonight we are pleased to have Shannon Kearns. Shannon T.L. Kearns is a transgender man who believes in the transformative power of stories. As an ordained priest, a playwright, and a theologian and a writer, all of his work revolves around making meaning through story. He's the founder and artistic director of Uprising Theater Company in Minneapolis, where he's joining us from tonight, the co-founder of queertheology.com, and is soon going to be publishing his first book with Erdman's Books. Shannon is a recipient of the Playwrights Center Jerome Fellowship in 2020-2021, and he was a Lambda Literary Fellow for 2019 and a Finovation Fellow for 2019-2020. He's a sought-after speaker on transgender issues and religion, as well as a skilled facilitator of a variety of workshops. His work with Brian G. Murphy at queertheology.com has reached more than 1 million people all over the world through videos, articles, online courses, and through community. Shannon's plays include Body and Blood, In a Stand of Dying Trees, Line of Sight, Twisted Deaths, The Resistance of My Skin, and Who Has Eyes to See. He's currently working on a television pilot, and I know I'm so excited to see how that goes. So, everyone, please welcome Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us, Shannon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you all and to spend some time talking about transgender issues tonight. I am going to attempt to share my screen. We're going to see how this goes. You know, it's technology, so we're gonna hope this works. All right. All right. So I think you're gonna maybe see me double on the screen. I apologize for that, but hopefully it'll work out. So I'm really excited to be here and talk to you tonight about trans issues. Trans folks are all over the news right now. We're seeing lots and lots of legislation and conversation around trans issues. And I know that a lot of people just don't know much about the trans community. And so you might be thinking, as we get started, like, why does any of this even matter? Can't we just love and accept everyone? Like, why do we need to spend all of this time doing a 101 talk? Or there's not that many trans people in the world, so like, why is this such a big deal? Or I don't even know any trans people. And so I just want to start out by saying we do this because in order to love people well, we need to really understand who they are and where they're coming from. The trans community is becoming more and more visible. People are coming out at younger and younger ages. And while those of us in the community know that trans people have been around for all of time, even if we didn't have the breadth of language that we do now, that for a lot of people, this idea is still new. And so you might not think that you know a person, that you know a trans person, but you also might be surprised. And even if you don't know someone, odds are that you know someone who does know someone, and that they're listening to the way that you talk to find out if you're a safe person to be around them or their loved one. And so this workshop is all about giving you the tools to be that safe person. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we're gonna start by defining some terms so that we're all on the same page. I'll talk a little bit about the difference between gender and sexuality. We'll talk about some of the unique pressures that trans people face and how you can discern what questions are appropriate to ask, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I know that if you have questions that come up while we're talking, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll capture them and I will answer all of them at the end. So let's get started with some terms just so that we're all on the same page. And so the first term is transgender. This is what we're talking about tonight. And this is a person whose understanding of their gender differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And trans is a Latin prefix that means across from. And so we're talking about people whose gender, how they understand themselves, what they know themselves to be differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. You might also hear people talking about cisgender. Cisgender is a word that it means someone's identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. So most people in the world are cisgender. Cisgender is, again, Latin. It means on the same side as. This is a term that originally started in academia. It became, and it's becoming more and more popular. And it's a way for us to talk about trans people and non-trans people that puts all of us in equal footing. So instead of talking about trans people, like trans people and normal people, or trans people and those other people, we can say transgender and cisgender, and we know what we're talking about. Gender identity is a person's intrinsic sense of their gender. And this is like who in your heart of hearts you know yourself to be. And then gender expression is the way that you share that intrinsic knowing with the rest of the world. This could be the way that you dress. It could be your mannerisms. It could be the way that you speak. But this is kind of your outward portraying of your gender. You'll hear people talk about gender diversity. And this is a really broad term for anyone who identifies or lives outside of the gender norms kind of prescribed by our society. Some other terms, the term non-binary. This is a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So some of the ways that it's understood is to describe someone whose gender identity isn't necessarily male or female. People sometimes talk about they feel on a spectrum of gender. They feel in between genders. They feel a little bit of all genders. And so they might use the word non-binary to describe themselves. And then the last term, I know we've gone through a lot of terms, going really fast. The last one is agender. And this is someone who doesn't identify with gender at all. They don't really consider themselves to have a gender identity. Now, we've got this trans umbrella. And so when you hear people talk about the trans community or transgender, folks are talking about a lot of different identities. And we can see some of the larger terms that people are using under this umbrella graphic. And so I do want to draw your attention to the kind of bottom portion of this graphic, which is like identities not under the trans umbrella, because I think that this trips some people up. And actually, this slide is a little bit confusing. So cisgender people, so folks that identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, they don't fall under the trans umbrella. Sometimes people who are cross-dressers or cross-dress don't consider themselves to be trans. This is just something that they do, but for them, it's something different than their intrinsic gender identity. Although some cross-dressers would identify themselves under the trans umbrella. Same with drag performers. There are lots of drag performers that are not trans. And there are some drag performers that are trans. And so this gets confusing, but drag performance and drag performers are not automatically underneath the trans umbrella. And then also intersex folks. Some intersex folks identify under the trans umbrella, some don't. So I know this gets really confusing, but it's important to name and to note that we need to allow people to identify how they identify, and that some people choose to align with the community and some people don't, and that's okay. Now, as we talk about this, I think it's also really important to note and understand that every single one of us has a gender identity. Whether we're cisgender or transgender, we all have a gender identity. And sometimes we talk about gender identity as if it's only those trans folks over there, right, that have a gender identity. But all of us have a gender identity. And along those lines, we also all have a sexual orientation. It's not just queer folks, it's not just LGBT folks, all of us have a sexual orientation. And sexual orientation and gender identity are two separate things. So I love this graphic. This is the really cute gender unicorn. And so it talks about, like, let's say that we are all this unicorn, that our gender identity is kind of like who we know ourselves to be. We know ourselves to be a man or a woman or on a spectrum or non-binary or agender. Like, this is who we know ourselves to be. And then we have our gender expression, which is how we choose to express our gender to the world. This can be through clothing, through mannerisms, through the way that we speak. Then we have the sex that we are assigned at birth. For most folks, this is either female or male, although there are folks who are assigned intersex at birth. And then we have the people that we're physically attracted to, right? And then we also have the people that we're emotionally attracted to. And so all of these things fit together and coalesce and make up who we are as people. And they make up our gender identity, and they make up our sexual orientation. And so there can be a trans person who identifies as straight. And there can be trans people that identify as bisexual or pansexual. And so all of these different combinations are available in all people. And I think once we really start to understand that, it really opens up how we have conversations about sexuality and gender. And it allows us to talk about the pressures that gendered society and kind of binary thinking, that you must be this way to be a man or you must be this way to be a woman, that we can start to open those up and have conversations about how that impacts all of us, not just trans folks, but cisgender folks as well. And so I want you to just take a moment and think about your life. We're not going to share this out loud. You can kind of do this on your own. But I would love for you to reflect on, what's the first gendered memory that you have, and what feelings does that bring up in you? And then also think about, what were you taught about gender as a child or a teenager? And what was that like for you? What did that do for you? And have there ever been times when you wanted to defy kind of traditional gender identity norms, but felt that you couldn't, or were told that you couldn't, or were punished for doing that? Like, how did that make you feel? Who were the people that told you that you could or you couldn't do certain things? Was it your peers? Was it your family? And then have you ever felt held back or stifled or, even suffocated by traditional gender roles? Have you felt like you couldn't express emotion the way that you wanted to, or that you couldn't engage in a particular activity the way that you wanted to? So I'm just going to pause for a moment for you to reflect on these questions. The reason I invite you to reflect on this is because, again, I think sometimes when we talk about trans issues or we talk about gender identity, we think that it's something out there, it's over there, and it's not for us. But I really want to invite us into a conversation to talk about how gender plays a role in all of our lives. Now, you might be wondering, you know, what is the deal with all of this language? Why do we have so many terms? Why does every time I hear about the LGBTQ community, that acronym gets longer? And so I just want to pause for a moment and address that. Because as our language continues to grow and evolve, we do continue to add more terms and letters to the LGBTQ. Now you often hear IA plus acronym. And I think it's actually really important and beautiful that we do this because so often we are a community that has lacked language to talk about our lives. And this lack of language has left a lot of us feeling like we don't belong anywhere and that there's no space for us. And so this kind of proliferation of terms is a really beautiful thing because it means that people are finally making themselves known in the world. And so I think the key thing to remember in all of this is that language is always shifting in all of the areas of life. I mean, how many of us grew up knowing what an iPhone was, right? Like this is language that has shifted over time and we adjust to it, right? Because we know that there are new technologies, there are new things that are developing, and that's really important. And so it's good to be curious. It's good to be respectful. It's great to honor the words that people use to describe their own lives and identities, even if you don't really understand it. And if you hear a word that you don't know, like it's okay to Google that word and figure out what it means and to learn more about it. If you have a relationship with a person who's using that word, you can ask them what they mean when they use it. Like, what does that word mean to you when you're saying that? Just be respectful that they might not want to explain it to you right at that moment or ever. And so if that's the case, you might need to do some of your other research and figure out as you go. But these terms and the language is just so important. And I'm just really excited that we have more of it. And so as we move into thinking about like, okay, we've learned some of these terms. We're probably overwhelmed by these terms. That's okay. What are the ways that we can be a good ally to the trans people in our lives? How can we support them? What does that even look like? And so one of the first things and the big things that you can do, one of the easiest and most important ways that you can respect another person is to find out what pronouns they use and then use them. Like it's really that simple. And it's really important to not make jokes about pronouns, whether they're yours or someone else's. I've been in a lot of settings where, you know, we've gone around the room, we've asked people to introduce themselves and to share their pronouns. And a cisgender person has like made a joke of their pronouns. And they think that they're being funny and they think that they're being like showing that they're cool with all of this new language. But what that does is it reinforces in the room that pronouns aren't that important and that they don't matter. And so I would encourage you to like take that seriously, to when you're asked what your pronouns are, to offer the ones that you use and you would like people to use for you, and then to honor the ones that other people use. I think sometimes if you're in a space where you feel like pronouns don't really matter to you, like you don't really care what people use for you, it can make you feel that other people shouldn't care either. But I know that one of the things for me, especially in my early transition, one of the hardest things was when people refused to use the right pronouns for me. It was so painful, and it did such harm to me, and it really hurt the relationships with the people I was trying to be friends with. And this wasn't just like someone who made a mistake. This is someone who just refused to get it right. And so it's really important that you use people's pronouns. There are lots and lots of different pronouns. The most common ones are he and she. You'll also hear lots of folks now using they as a singular pronoun. So just like you would say, he went to the store, when referring to a person who uses they pronouns, you say they went to the store. And I know that some people are going to complain that this isn't grammatically correct. You're going to complain that they has never been used as a singular pronoun, and it's just not true. They has been in use as a singular pronoun for centuries now. And honestly, we use it all the time when we don't know what someone's gender is. If someone dropped their phone, you say someone dropped their phone, and you know that it's a singular person, but you don't know the gender of the person who dropped the phone. And so we use it all the time without thinking. So if someone tells you their pronoun is they, just use they. My best advice, if you think that you're going to mess up someone's pronoun, is to practice it in your head, to really get used to saying their name and their pronoun together over and over again. If this is someone you're really close to, it's maybe someone you're related to, it's your child, you can look at a photo of them and practice their name and their pronoun while looking at them so that you don't mess it up. And it's also important to make sure that you're using someone's pronouns, whether they're present or not. I know that some folks will use the right pronoun when the person is with them, but then use a different pronoun with the rest of the family or with friends, and that's not okay. You should really be using the person's pronoun all the time. And if you do mess up, which especially in early transition, especially when someone has just come out to you, happens, the best thing that you can do is just to apologize simply, correct yourself, and move on. So if you're in a room and you say, oh, I mean she, you can just say, I'm sorry, she, and then move on. What makes it worse is to kind of throw yourself on the ground and be like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm such a terrible person. I don't know how I got that wrong. I keep messing it up. When you do that, it draws more attention to the mistake and draws attention to everyone around. And then it also puts the person who you've just misgendered in the position to have to comfort you. And so it's really important to just simply apologize and move on and to not make the mistake again. Now, what if you think someone's pronoun or name is silly or weird? Honestly, it doesn't matter. Just like you don't get to choose someone's name, you also don't get to choose their pronoun. And so if someone tells you what their name and pronouns are, you have a responsibility to respect them and to use their name and pronouns correctly. So I think it's just important that we honor one another and that we do that by respecting each other's pronouns. Now let's talk about questions. I kind of use this rubric to think about if a question is appropriate to ask. Now, I'm assuming in this case that you are an adult who is talking to another adult, or potentially you're an adult who's talking to a child who is not your child. So kind of we can talk about ways that this might be different or ways to have better conversations if you're talking to your own kid. But the first one is just, do you actually need to know the answer to this question? Is this something you absolutely need to know in order to be better in community with this person, to better parent this person, to be a better teacher to this person? Or is this just something that you're like curious about? If it's just something that you're curious about, often a better first step is to Google, to read a book, to kind of look for the answer somewhere else. I also think, would you ask this same type of question of a cisgender person? And if the answer is no, then really think about, then why am I going to ask this question to this person? Could this question be a violation of some kind of boundary? If you're a teacher and you're asking a student, could this be a violation of that relationship? Might they feel pressured to answer the question? Do they have agency to say no and not answer it? And if they don't, then you might not want to ask the question. The second kind of rubric is, can you find out on your own? Is this something that you can find the answer to another way? Can you read a book about it? Can you Google an article? Can you ask a colleague or another parent? If so, that might be a good first step. And then finally, is this the appropriate time or place to ask this question? I can't tell you how many times I've been asked really, really personal questions in public and in a place where suddenly, because the question has been asked, my safety is now in question, or people can overhear us and it's really awkward. And so it might be a perfectly appropriate question to ask, but in a coffee shop might not be the place to ask it. And so kind of think through that. Like, are you in a setting where the person who you're asking the question of will feel safe to answer? Are there other people around? Might there be someone that can overhear? Are you in a situation where this question could put someone at risk? Then maybe this is not the time. And always to remember power dynamics. If someone feels that they can't say no to you, if you're a supervisor or a teacher, then maybe not asking a question is the way to go. Because sometimes what happens is someone might be willing to answer a question in the moment, but then they feel awkward and uncomfortable about it later. And that puts a weird strain on relationships. So keep those things in mind as you're thinking about whether or not to ask certain questions. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the unique pressures and things that are faced by the trans community. There was a study done by the National Task Force that looked at, it was one of the largest studies ever done on the trans community, and it found out some really distressing things. And we're going to walk through some of these slides. So the key findings of this study, which interviewed hundreds and hundreds of trans folks, is that discrimination was incredibly pervasive. And the combination of anti-trans bias and persistent structural racism is especially devastating. So people of color in general fared worse than white participants across the board, with African-American transgender respondents faring worse than all others in almost every area examined. Trans folks lived in extreme poverty, and the rate of suicidation and attempts on their life was also astronomical. And I want to just take a moment to talk about the suicide risk, because often folks will say, like, we should discourage kids from being trans because they're at a higher rate of suicide. And actually, that's the exact opposite of what these studies are finding. These studies are finding that when a kid is encouraged in their gender identity, when they have one supportive adult in their life, their suicide risk drops by 40%. That when a kid is around someone who uses their name and pronouns, when they're able to access gender affirming care from a doctor, when they're encouraged to be themselves, they are happier and healthier, and their mental health is better. And so I just want to note that, like, part of what happens sometimes with these studies is that people use it to say, like, you shouldn't be trans, instead of we need to change the world so that it's safer for trans folks. And so I just want to name that up front. The next thing is that trans folks have, in education and in other spaces, are experiencing a lot of abuse and harassment, both from teachers and from other peers. And so we see that is huge in this study. And then finally, that there's like this idea of cumulative discrimination, which is that participants are experiencing acts of discrimination that are compounded because they're experiencing a bunch of them at once or over the course of their lives. And so this is all like really dire stuff. And I share this again, not to say that like we shouldn't be encouraging people to be trans, but instead to encourage all of us to really get active in changing the systems that are making it unsafe for trans folks and trans kids especially to exist and to be in this world. And so some of the things that you might be thinking about, I would encourage you to think about how your community, and you can talk about communities however they are structured for you, of like, is this your church community? Is this your school community? Is this your family? That here are some questions to think through as you're thinking through how to make spaces more welcoming for trans folks. Are there things that you do in your community that are heavily gendered? And do they need to be? And if they do need to be, do trans folks know that they're allowed to choose which gendered thing to go to? So if there's always a men's group at your church, do trans men in your church know that they can go to the men's group? Just as an example. As you think about your community, think about what might be the barriers that trans or non-binary people would face in your community. Do they have access to a safe bathroom? Are there ways for them to indicate what their name and pronouns are? Is there enough education that's been done with your community to make sure that they're not going to be misgendered or even looked at weird when they enter the space? How can you make it easier for people in your life to let you know their name and pronouns? Can you get into a practice of every time you meet someone new, introducing yourself with your name and pronouns and inviting them to do the same? And then finally, how can you let gender diverse people know that your community is welcoming for them, if it is, and if you're willing to do that work to put it in. And if you want to talk specifically about faith communities, I am an ordained priest. I've done a lot of work with faith communities. Would be happy to talk more about that. So I'm going to pause there. I gave you lots and lots of information very, very quickly. And so I want to pause and see if we've got any questions.
All right, so I was taking a look over on the Facebook page, and we had some comments from Jill Edwards, who says, referring back to the pronouns discussion, that using them when the person is not around is critical. It changes you as well as respects them.
Absolutely.
And I totally, totally agree with that. But if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat, or if you're interested in hopping onto the Zoom with me and Shannon for a few minutes to ask your questions in person, you're more than welcome. I will put the link in the space below, and we'll just give it a few minutes and see what happens. Shannon, if you're okay with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Let's get that chat. A link for you. All right, so the link is in the chat. If you want to come on over, you're more than welcome. We'll let you in. Otherwise, I'm just going to chat. Shannon's ear off, ask my questions. One thing that really stuck with me that you talked about was the power dynamics that are inherent in conversations. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how to potentially gauge those dynamics if you're not really aware of them. I think, like, for myself, it's really a good practice to just, like, I don't know, implicit biases and explicit biases. And so I would just love if you could touch on that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like anyone who you don't have like a really intimate peer relationship with, there's going to be inherently a power dynamic, whether that's you as an adult talking to a young person, or even whether it's like you as a cisgender person talking to a trans person that you don't know very well. Questions are always going to be trickier in those situations. And I know for me, some of the way that I'm gauging things too is like, what is my role in this interaction? So like on an event like tonight, I'm going to answer a lot of questions that I would not be willing to answer if you and I were out to coffee, right? Because I'm here in a different role. And I've come into this space knowing that questions might get asked that are weird or funky or like whatever.
Sure.
And so I think like that's part of it. I would say that like anytime you're in a position where you've got any kind of power over this person, whether that's like teacher, boss, even a coworker can be a little dicey. And like anytime where a person might feel weird about saying no, like that's also something to kind of think through. And that can be hard to like gauge in the moment.
Yeah. The thing that pops up for me is like knowing the difference between someone's no from a comfort level or just like an appropriateness level versus like no, I don't want, or the ability to say no because of the power dynamic. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I think, as you were saying, it's just like such a fine line, but to be so present and aware of what's going on is so vital to these kinds of conversations, I guess.
Yeah, and I think especially for young trans folks and for trans folks who are just coming out, the pressure that we feel to educate everyone is so strong. I mean, I remember like just coming out to myself and feeling the need to do one-on-one presentations. Like I barely could articulate my own self, and yet I felt like I'm the only one in this space. How else are people going to learn? And so I did a lot of things that I think were probably not great for me to be doing, and that were hard for me to be
Mm.
doing, because I felt the pressure to educate and to be that for people. And so like encouraging folks to figure out how else might you be able to get this information is why I make that recommendation, because there are way more resources now and there are other ways to get information, so that you don't have to put all of the pressure on an individual.
Yeah, I that's something that I've learned in my work, like just self work in the past couple of years,
Yeah.
is taking the onerous off of everybody else. Like, what can I take on? What's my responsibility, and what's not theirs? So,
Yeah.
thank you again for that reminder,
Yeah.
that we can do
And
our own work too.
yeah, and I'll say it's very different when someone comes to me and said, listen, I had this question. I went to these three sources and like I'm still confused, or I don't like understand the answer I'm getting. Can you help me? Or hey, I really have this question. Can you point me to resources? Like that is a very different posture. And when someone comes to me with that, half the time I'll just answer the question because it feels different, right? Like it feels like a different conversation that we're having, and it shows me that they're willing to do some work and to do some research, but need like to be pointed in the right direction. And
Yeah,
that's like I'm always happy to do that.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for answering my question.
Of course.
If we have any more, please feel free to either put them in the chat on Facebook or hop on in to the Zoom and chat with me and Shannon. Um, I might ask one more question to kill some time, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, you had mentioned your work in faith communities, and I know that like the conversation of faith with trans rights and trans gender like identity and issues has been very prevalent recently. Is there anything like an overview that you can touch on how to hold both of those things like at once, and kind of just your relationship to religious faith communities and your experience as a transgender man?
Yeah, I mean that's a whole
I
another
know, not to like open it up
hour long
for.
talk. So I will say this, on queertheology.com, we have a whole section on trans stuff and Christianity in particular, where I share lots more of my story, and there's lots of resources on there. So I would point people towards that. I also have, shameless plug, I have a book coming out in August called In the Margins, that is both about my story of coming out and coming to terms with gender identity and with faith, but it's also a retelling of 10 Bible stories. So for folks that are like nerdy into the Bible, that might be a good resource. I will say that there are more and more faith communities that are welcoming and like not just welcoming, but like really affirming and uplifting the trans community, which is fantastic. There are more and more trans folks that are being ordained as clergy across denominations, which is super exciting. And there's a lot of really beautiful work that is being done that says that you don't have to choose between your gender identity or your sexuality and your faith tradition, that not only can these things coexist, but that they can I would say like enhance and inform and beautify one another, which has very much been my experience. And so part of my work is like helping faith communities have some of these conversations, but it's less about like how can we figure out our theology and more about what can we learn from queer and trans folks of faith that can actually enhance our own faith, because that to me is where the real power is and where things actually start to change in communities, and where um, queer and trans folks aren't just like tacitly accepted, they're actually welcomed into the full life of community. And that's good for everyone, right? Not just
Always.
queer and trans folks, it's good for all people.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know that I'm gonna go check out your website and just like peruse and absorb as much of it as I can. I put it also in the chat, so if anybody wants that for convenience purposes, it's there. Um, I think we'll stick around for like 1 or 2 more minutes for
Sure.
anyone to hop on, ask some questions, and then we can wrap up and do the dang thing next time. Awesome. So how did you link up with the project? Just to kill some time
Yeah,
while we're waiting for
that's a
questions.
great question. Brandon reached out to me, but also my wife and I are in the process of moving to Independence. And so I was a playwright in residence at the William Inch House last summer, and
Right.
so spent the summer in Independence and like fell in love with the community. And so we are kind of uprooting our lives to move to Independence. And so I'm so excited about the work that Project Q&A is doing, and that it exists, and also like the programming is incredibly robust.
Mm.
So when Brandon was like, "Hey, do you have some time?" I was like, "Absolutely! Like let's do this. I love this." And so I'm so excited to be in community with folks, um and to be a resource too. Like one of the reasons that I'm excited to move to town is to be a resource, um, for parents, for faith communities, for folks who are like wanting to do this work and do it well. It's incredible to me how thriving the LGBTQ community is, in this area, and that's like it's thrilling to me. I'm really excited.
That's amazing. And not to like fine tune you 2 point or too much, but when are you moving so we know when to start um jumping on the bandwagon for resources from you?
We are we're in this like we're in a slow move. So this summer we have a place in Independence, but like we might be moving to another. It's a whole thing.
Sure.
Moving is like super complicated, but this summer we'll
Great.
be there. Yeah,
Amazing. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for Pride
that is the plan.
and
Yeah,
Southeast Kansas Pride. Okay, amazing. Very excited
yeah,
for this.
yeah. It's gonna be great.
Awesome. Shannon, thank you so much
My pleasure.
for taking some time doing this presentation for us. We're so grateful, and we would love for you to come back and speak again, or participate in a project in any way, shape, or form. So thanks
Great.
so much. Um, Let's see, what else do I have to say? Next month, we're going to be talking to Sarah Cunningham, founder of Free Mom Hugs, on Wednesday, June 15th. And we're going to be discussing how to support your LGBTQIA+, because those are all important, child. And if you'd like to find out more about Project Q&A, our work, to view past Q&A talks, visit our website, follow us on social media. You obviously know where to find us since you're on Facebook. And hopefully you can join us for our next Q&A talk next month. So again, Shannon, thank you so much. I'm very
My
appreciative.
pleasure.
And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and that the move goes smoothly.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Awesome. Sounds good. And we'll stop the stream now. Okay.